Hi everyone, my name's Ben Twomey and I'm the Labour and Co-Operative Candidate for Police and Crime Commissioner in Warwickshire, my home county. And I want to talk to you today about drugs. I want to talk about drugs not just because they matter to me. I've actually worked for 3 different police and crime commissioners and specialised in drug policy as well as related areas like organised crime and stop and search policy. In Warwickshire, I've got a survey out at the moment asking people what really matters to them, and the top priority that's come back so far is drug dealing in our communities. So that's something that people really want to get on top of, and I've got a few ideas for how we do that. So I want to talk particularly about county lines, which, if you don't know, is a form of the drugs market working where big city gangs, drugs gangs, come out to the smaller towns in rural areas like in Warwickshire, and they force children or vulnerable people to sell their drugs and take the risks. And there's often clashes between those city gangs in the smaller towns, as we've seen in Warwickshire as well. Particularly affected are Rugby, Nuneaton and Leamington, where tragically very recently there was a murder related to county lines between the gangs that we see from London and from Birmingham coming over to our county. So county lines, while being new, doesn't change the fundamentals of the drugs market and how it works. This is something that we need to get on top of if we're going to change it. And for me, there's 2 key things that matter when it comes to drugs and how we police them. One is demand, which is the people buying the drugs, and 2, perhaps more importantly, is getting on top of supply, which is the people that are selling the drugs. And I'll talk you through how those things have changed over time very recently and what I think we should do about them. So first of all, if we start with the demand for drugs, the people that buy the most drugs, the people that will go way out of their way to get hold of drugs, are those that sadly are problematically addicted, and by that I mean that they are struggling to function in their day-to-day life unless they get hold of their drugs, particularly heroin and crack cocaine, which a senior police officer described to me once as the bread and butter of county lines drugs trading. So getting on top of that is going to be absolutely vital in terms of making sure that the demand reduces. So how do you reduce the number of people who are addicted to drugs? Well, you get them treatment. You make sure that they're in treatment and they are potentially recovering. That's something that's not really happening widely anymore because of the huge cuts that have happened to drug treatment services in our county and across the country because of cuts in funding from the Conservative governments and the Lib Dem Conservative coalition from 2010 onwards. What that means really is that people are trapped in their addiction, which means they continue to commit crimes both to fund it. So that might be that they are stealing from people, lots of the shoplifting and burglaries that we see. I could go down to addiction. And it might be that they are dealing drugs themselves in order to make some money. It might be that they're even putting themselves at risk through, for example, sex work. All these things that take up a large amount of police time, which aren't really good for anybody. And one of the problems with that is that these people are addicted to drugs. We know that that addiction is a health issue and it can be cured. And that we're not giving them the support. So when the crimes happen and then when we struggle to respond to them, of course the police struggle to respond because there's so many crimes now and there's so much money missing from the police budget. In Warwickshire alone, there's still £20 million missing compared to in 2010. Then overstretched police are struggling to deal with a problem that doesn't need to be there because these people should have the support in the first place, which is much cheaper. And that way we can keep them on the right track and out of the addiction and out of the predatory gang's grasp. So that's the demand side. Then there's a bit of a grey area, a blurry area, which is where supply and demand sort of meet. So that's when the drugs gangs are exploiting the most vulnerable and forcing them to sell drugs. As I said, on county lines, that's what happens, often involving children. I work with children in care on a day-to-day basis. I'm the head of policy for a national charity, so I do a lot of the campaigning, trying to keep them safe and trying to improve their lives. And one of the things that's happened in the last 10 years is that there's been a big increase in the number of children that are going into care in the first place. So that means a big number of children who often find themselves in residential children's homes. Sometimes they're sent out of area, it's called, which means they could go up to hundreds of miles away from their home county, let's say, where they have their support network of adults that they might trust, and this makes them really, really vulnerable. A parliamentary committee described it as making them like sitting ducks for exploitation when they are farmed out miles away. It's, you know, these are children who've had a really hard time, and we're not protecting them anymore. And this is happening more and more often, where they become more vulnerable to criminal gangs. There's also a huge rise in school exclusions happening in Warwickshire and across the country, and that's, I understand from the teachers that I know and speak to, that there's just not the pastoral care and the support there anymore. So when a teacher is trying to manage a whole class of 30 plus children and there's one child being disruptive, and that might be because, let's say, they've suffered some trauma in their life, or they've come to school hungry because they don't have enough food in the home and they're distracted, then the teacher has to send them out the lesson so that the other children can continue to learn. But previously, where there would have been someone to pick up the pieces and help turn that child around and, you know, give them the extra support that they need, that's not there anymore. So more and more children are finding themselves on that trajectory towards being excluded, and then once they're excluded, again, significantly more likely to be picked up by criminal gangs, exploited, forced to sell drugs, and on that road towards prison, or worse, really, when it comes to the knife crime that's associated with this. So that's another way that things seem to be getting worse. Finally, a final example I'll give is the children and young people who are finding themselves really abandoned to these criminal gangs because there's no youth services left across the country anymore. There's been almost 9 out of every 10 youth clubs that we had in Warwickshire in 2010 have been flogged off or shut down by the Conservative-run County Council, and there's already been links between this made, proper evidence that says that where these youth services have disappeared has disproportionately seen a rise in knife crime. So these young people who previously would have had something productive to do to keep them off the streets, keep them out of trouble, no longer have that, and that means that they're getting caught up in this gang violence and in the very related area of county lines and drug dealing as well. So that's where the supply and the demand sort of gets a bit mixed up, because although these children are being used to supply the drugs, they're actually also often very vulnerable, potentially coerced by having to take the drugs themselves, and it's really difficult to get around how we protect those young people, and at the same time we target drug dealers. So what I campaigned on before is that these children are victims, they're being exploited, that's why we call it child criminal exploitation, and they're being exploited as victims. They shouldn't be treated as criminals. We need to focus on the real criminals, who are the ones that are doing the exploiting, the ones that are the most violent, the most vicious, abusive people in our society, and make sure that they're the ones that are really accountable for all of this misery that is being wreaked with these children being exploited and with these people being trapped in their addiction and peddled more and more drugs all the time.